Have you ever wondered how great chess players spot hidden tactical opportunities? Today we are diving into a game that demonstrates an eagle-eyed vision in chess. Thanks to his sharp focus and total awareness of the entire board, the great tactician Leonid Stein identifies a hidden target that is invisible to the naked eye. So let's learn to be aware of the entire board and see if you can also spot the secret target and the shocking sacrifice. Stein's opponent, Sigurjonsson, starts with e4 and Stein plays the Sicilian defense. After knight f3 and d6, instead of the common d4, white plays knight c3 first. But after a6, d4, c takes d, knight takes d4 and knight f6, the game transposes into the Najdorf variation. Now the main lines for white are either bishop g5, for example, which is considered the most aggressive line, or white can try bishop e3, or Bobby Fischer's favorite bishop c4, or a quieter and a more positional line, bishop e2, but instead of all this, in our game white goes for f4, which is also perfectly playable. White immediately starts his expansion on the king side and creates an immediate threat, as the white pawn is on f4, and it controls the e5 square. White is threatening e5 with a tempo, and after the black knight retreats, he is going to push the pawn to e6. Let's say if black doesn't take measures against this threat and plays b5, then after e5 and the possible exchange of the pawns, black must spend a tempo to save his knight, and white would sacrifice the pawn, threatening to capture on f7, after which the black king would lose the right to castle, so black must accept the sacrifice, and for the pawn, white has great compensation. As you see, black's king side is destroyed, this is seriously weakened, this diagonal is exposed, the pawns are doubled, the development of the dark squared bishop is obstructed, as it will take a lot of time for black to push the e-pawns forward to open this bishop's diagonal, and the black king is stuck in the center, while white comfortably continues his development, bishop d3 with a tempo threatening queen h5 check, and if g6, bishop takes g6 check, h takes g, queen takes h8, so the black king is stuck in the center, while the white king is ready to castle, and white is much better. For this reason, to prevent the threat of e5 and e6, Stein plays knight d7, taking the e5 square under control. But white renews the threat. He plays knight f3, taking this square under control, and again, he is ready to push the pawn to e5 and e6. That's why Stein prevents it by playing e6 himself. And now it would make little sense for white to push the pawn forward, because after the exchange of the pawns and knight g4, the white pawn falls under attack. It cannot move forward as it's blockaded by the black pawn, and white must defend the pawn with bishop f4, but black can attack the pawn for the third time. And in order to hold the pawn, white must make an ugly move, queen e2, closing the bishop's diagonal, and it isn't clear how white is going to develop his kingside, while black continues his active development with bishop b4, creating new threat. Bishop takes c3 check, followed by queen takes c3 check, and queen takes a1. So black is better. For this reason, white refrains from pushing the pawn to e5, instead he develops his bishop. And Stein tries to seize the initiative. He plays knight c5, putting more pressure on the e4 pawn and also eyeing the bishop. So at any moment Stein can exchange his knight for the white bishop and get the advantage of two bishops. And again, if white pushes the pawn forward, after the exchange of the pawns, this time black would play knight d5. He has a great centralized knight, both of his knights are greatly placed, he is ready to capture on c3, damaging white's pawn structure, and if white exchanges the knights himself, the black queen would be centralized, she is greatly placed in the center of the board, and again black is ready to capture on d3, getting the advantage of two bishops and damaging white's pawn structure. For this reason, one more time, white refrains from pushing the pawn to e5 and simply castles. Stein develops the bishop, and in order to prevent black from the standard advance in the Sicilian, from the b5 advance, after which black starts the expansion on the queen side besides vacating the b7 square for his bishop. White plays a4. Stein castles and white makes another prophylactic move, king h1, moving his king away from this diagonal in order to avoid unpleasant checks. So white has prevented b5, that's why Stein plays b6, vacating the b7 square for his bishop. And black is ready to put more pressure to on the e4 pawn. So white doesn't want to tie his pieces to the defense of this pawn, as it's defended only twice, and after bishop b7 he would be forced to defend it one more time. For this reason, he kicks the active c5 knight out. He plays b4, which on the one hand seriously weakens his queen side. The pawn itself is weak on b4. Besides that, as the pawn has left the b2 square, the knight isn't defended by the pawn, so the knight is also weak. On the other hand, after black exchanges, that's exactly what happened in our game, and white recaptures with the pawn, his e4 pawn isn't weak anymore. It's reinforced by the d3 pawn. Stein plays bishop b7, queen b3, developing the queen and defending both of his weaknesses, and Stein occupies the open file, putting pressure on the insufficiently defended knight. And here white makes a natural move, which turns out to be a mistake. He develops his last minor piece, bishop e3. So what can be more natural? However, we have reached the first critical position. Bishop e3 turns out to be a mistake. So you can pause the video and try to find how Stein exploits white's inaccuracy and seizes the initiative. And try to find not just the first move, but also the follow-up. So Stein executes the standard breakthrough, the standard break in the Sicilian, d5. However, it was necessary to calculate the consequences of this move. By playing d5, of course, he is attacking the e4 pawn, he is threatening to win a pawn, but white makes the natural move, e5, attacking the knight. And if knight was forced to retreat, let's say if it retreats to d7, it turns out that white would get an advantage. So d5 also has a drawback. It is closing the bishop's diagonal. So at the moment this bishop is bad, and white could have blockaded the pawn, and the bishop would have remained locked, while the white knight would be greatly placed on this great blockading square, and the black pawns cannot, of course, kick it out. The same would be the case if instead of knight d7, the black knight jumped on g4, which looks more active, attacking the bishop, but again, white would have played bishop d4, again blockading the pawn, and again black would have remained with a bad bishop. So it was necessary to see the follow-up before pushing the pawn to d5. And now we can see Stein's follow-up. He pushes, now we can see why bishop e3 was a mistake. The bishop and the knight can be forked. So he pushes the pawn forward, forking and also opening his bishop's diagonal. And it turns out that if white captures the black knight, Stein would have simply captured, and next move he would get his piece back and he would get a positional advantage. For example, of course, black is ready to capture the knight or the bishop, and the best thing white can do is to capture on d4, and after bishop takes d4, knight takes, and queen takes d4, black is better because he has much more active pieces, he has the centralized queen, he's occupying the only open file. Besides that, he also gets the material advantage because both the knight and the d3 pawn are under attack. For this reason, after Stein pushed the pawn to d4, white cannot capture the knight, so he must capture the pawn, the d4 pawn. If he captures with the bishop, Stein prepared bishop takes f3, exchanging his great bishop for the knight in order to remove the defender of the bishop. The knight from f3 used to defend the bishop, and now it's under attack. And the best thing white can do is to capture the knight in his turn, attacking the bishop, but after bishop takes f6, bishop takes and queen takes, black still is better, because it's true, the black bishop is under attack, but the white knight is also under attack. And after the possible exchange, again, black is better because he has a better pawn structure, d3 is weak, and of course his, which is even more important, his pieces are much more active. His rook is occupying the c-file, the white queen, which is under attack, must retreat to a passive square, and all white major pieces would be passively placed, while the opposite is the case for the black pieces. Black would activate his second rook by playing either rook d8 or rook c8. He would centralize his queen and put more pressure on the weakness on d3 and on b4, and black would be much better. For this reason, after d4, instead of capturing with the bishop, in order to prevent bishop takes f3, white captures on d4 with the knight. And the black knight is still under attack, so Stein plays knight g4 with a tempo attacking the bishop, and the white bishop retreats to g1. And we have reached the second critical position. So Stein has sacrificed the pawn, so white is up material at the moment. And it's true, white has weaknesses. On the queen side, b4 is weak, it's attacked by the bishop, but it's defended by the queen. The knight is also weak, it isn't supported by the pawn, it's attacked by the rook, but it's defended again by the queen. The d4 knight is also attacked by the black queen, but it's defended by the bishop. So it might seem that although white has many weaknesses in the center and on the queen side, he is defending all of them and he is ready to consolidate his position, after which he would remain with an extra pawn. However, it isn't the case, because there is one more weakness in white's position, an invisible weakness, a hidden target, so to speak. And you can pause the video and try to find this hidden target and Stein's spectacular idea. So, identifying the weaknesses in the center and on the queen side is easy. But it takes an eagle's eye and awareness of the entire board to spot the weakness on the king side. And this weakness is, paradoxically as it might sound, is the h2 pawn, because it's defended by the king and the bishop. However, Stein notices that the white king actually doesn't have any squares to move. g1 is occupied by the bishop, g2 is occupied by the pawn, so he destroys white's king side, exposing the white king, opening the h-file, sacrificing the knight, also attacking the rook. And now it turns out that it's clear that white cannot capture the knight with the bishop, because the bishop would stop defending the knight, black would immediately get the sacrificed piece back, and also he has turned back the pawn by capturing the h2 pawn, so the material balance would be re-established, and black would even get material advantage, besides having a great positional advantage, because everything is under attack now. The knight is under attack, the pawn is under attack, the d3 pawn is also under attack, so black is winning. But what if instead of capturing the knight with the bishop, white captures it with the king, so that the bishop still defends the knight? So now we can see why it was important to spot that the white king doesn't have squares to move. If only the black queen could move to h4, that would be checkmate in 1. And that's exactly what Stein prepared. He would have moved the bishop away from the queen's way, creating two threats, queen h4 checkmate, and also the knight is under attack. So bishop takes c3 is also a threat. Of course, white must defend against the checkmate threat. Let's say he can play bishop f2, taking this square under control, but black would get the sacrificed piece back. Besides that, he would win material, as both the knight and the rook are under attack. Besides that, he has a great positional advantage, because the white king is exposed while the black king is absolutely safe. For this reason, after Stein played the spectacular move knight takes h2, white cannot accept the sacrifice, and his rook is under attack. For this reason, white makes the best move, rook c1, saving his rook and also reinforcing the weak knight. And Stein moves his knight away. So the knight has completed its mission. It has got back the sacrificed pawn and destroyed white's kingside. So now it returns to g4. The material balance has been re-established, but it turns out that besides getting back the material, Stein will actually win material, because black is still threatening bishop takes b4, or maybe even bishop c5. It doesn't matter. The main threat would be after that queen h4 check, followed by checkmate next move. And bishop c5 would also attack the knight for the second time, or bishop takes b4 would win a pawn. So what can white do against this terrible threat? Turns out that not much, actually. For example, he cannot move his bishop to f2 or e3 in order to vacate the g1 square for his king, because both of these squares are controlled by the black knight. Neither can he play g3 to vacate the g2 square for his king and take the h4 square under control, because it's illegal. The g2 pawn is pinned. So white plays knight g4. The idea is to meet bishop takes f4 or bishop c5 with knight g5, closing the queen's diagonal. But Stein, of course, captures on b4, and now he is up a pawn. Threatening checkmate in 2, that's why knight g5 and queen d5. Threatening checkmate and offering the exchange of the queens. He is up a pawn, so the queen exchange would be in his favor, of course. Knight f3 follows, defending against the checkmate, and Stein exchanges the queens. Knight takes b3, bishop d5, attacking the knight. Knight d2, defending the knight, and bishop c3, attacking the rook. Rook b1, so Stein plays energetically. b5, creating a passed pawn. A takes b, a takes b. Knight e4, the knight is attacking the bishop. So this knight is white's best piece. And for this reason, Stein gives up his bishop pair, exchanging his great bishop for white's best piece. Bishop takes d5, e takes d. And rook c4, activating the rook and eyeing the e4 pawn. g3 followed, and h5, reinforcing his knight, fixing the weakness, the g3 weakness. After the knight moves away, the g-pawn still wouldn't be able to move, and also vacating the h7 square for the king in order to avoid any possible back rank issues. King g2 followed. Stein develops his second rook. In order to defend the second rank, white plays rook c2. However, this lets Stein deliver another tactical blow. The rook on c2 is unguarded, so bishop takes e5, winning the second pawn. White doesn't have time to capture the bishop as his rook is under attack. So he exchanges the rooks, but after b takes c, the knight is under attack. If white captures the bishop after c takes b and rook takes b3, black simply captures on e5 and he is 2 pawns up. For this reason, instead of capturing the bishop, white plays knight a5. Now both the bishop and the pawn is under attack. If black moves the bishop, white would get one of the pawns back, but Stein invades the second rank with a check. King f3, and the pawn and the bishop are still under attack, but Stein plays bishop d4, saving his bishop and also the pawn indirectly. It turns out that if white captures the pawn, black actually has created a terrible threat of checkmate in 2. Knight h2 check would follow. The only move would be bishop takes h2. The white bishop would be deflected, and rook f2 checkmate would follow. So the pawn is untouchable. That's why, in order to prevent this terrible threat of knight h2 check followed by checkmate, white exchanges the bishops. Before capturing the bishop, Stein plays rook d3 check, so he plays precisely in order to force the white king to move to the second rank, where he is less actively placed, and only now rook takes d4 with a tempo. The king isn't on f3, he isn't defending the pawn, so this pawn is under attack. White plays e5, saving the pawn. And c3 follows. Rook c1, and the black rook returns to the second rank with a check. King f3 follows, and rook d3 check, targeting the pawn. And after king g2, so this pawn is white's main weakness now, and Stein attacks it for the second time. Knight e3 check, and after king f2, knight f5, it turns out that white is losing the third pawn, and his position is absolutely hopeless. For this reason, he resigned. And now I recommend watching a game where Stein executes one of his longest combinations. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.